March 23, 1943, 7,000 feet above Abbeville, France. The morning air was crystalline and cold. Leutnant Franz Stigler's hands gripped the control column of his Focke-Wulf 190 as he rolled his fighter into attack position. Below him, a formation of American P-47 Thunderbolts droned westward, returning from a fighter sweep. They looked heavy, almost clumsy in their tight formation. Stigler had 28 confirmed victories. He knew how to kill fighters. The doctrine was simple, proven through 3 years of combat: approach from ahead and above. Dive through the formation at maximum speed. Fire a concentrated burst into the lead aircraft. The closing speed would be tremendous, perhaps 800 miles per hour combined velocity, but the attack would be over before the enemy could react. German pilots had used this tactic to devastating effect against British Hurricanes, Soviet Yaks, and earlier American fighters. It worked because most fighters mounted their guns in the wings, where convergence patterns created dead zones directly ahead at close range. Stigler pushed his throttle forward and nosed into his dive. The lead Thunderbolt grew larger in his gun sight. At 1,000 meters, he could see the American's propeller disc. At 800 meters, he could distinguish the pilot's canopy. At 600 meters, he armed his guns, 2 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, all firing forward through the propeller arc. At 400 meters, something changed. The Thunderbolt's nose seemed to erupt, not the scattered winking of wing-mounted guns firing from separated points, but a concentrated wall of tracers that appeared to originate from a single point of light. 8 streams of 50 caliber fire, each weapon firing 800 rounds per minute, converging into a cone of destruction that filled Stigler's entire windscreen. He pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. Something hammered his left wing. Metal screamed. The Focke-Wulf shuddered violently. He fought for control, rolling away from the formation, diving for cloud cover. Only when he leveled out at 2,000 feet did he dare look at the damage. His left aileron was gone, simply torn away. The wing's leading edge looked like it had been attacked with an axe. 27 holes that he could count, each large enough to fit his fist through. The engagement had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. He hadn't even had time to fire. That evening, back at his base near Abbeville, Stigler wrote his combat report with unusual care. The American fighter's forward-firing armament creates a defensive barrier unlike anything previously encountered, he wrote. Frontal attacks as currently practiced appear inadvisable without significant tactical modification. His commanding officer read the report, frowned, and filed it away. It was one of hundreds of similar reports flooding Luftwaffe, headquarters that spring. The pilots were describing something the High Command didn't want to hear. The rules of air combat were changing, and Germany's fighters were on the wrong side of the equation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the P-47's forward-firing capability became so feared, one must first understand what German pilots had learned to expect from fighter armament. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 mounted a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 machine guns firing through the engine cowling. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 or 4 20mm cannon in the wing roots. These installations created highly accurate, centerline-mounted weapons that made German fighters deadly in pursuit, but they created relatively modest firepower when viewed head-on. A Bf 109 attacking from directly, ahead presented only 3 gun muzzles to its target. The closing speed was so high that the engagement window lasted barely a second. If the German pilot's aim was perfect, he might land 5 or 6 shells, and perhaps 20 machine gun rounds on target. Damaging, certainly. Often lethal against lightly built fighters, but not overwhelming. Allied fighters followed similar design philosophy. The British Spitfire mounted 8 rifle-caliber machine guns in its wings. The Soviet Yak-3 carried a single cannon and 2 machine guns. Even the American P-51 Mustang, which would later become legendary, mounted 6 50 caliber machine guns distributed across its wings. The convergence patterns of wing-mounted weapons created a critical limitation. The guns were angled inward to intersect at a specific range, typically 200 to 300 meters. At ranges shorter or longer than this convergence point, the bullet streams spread apart, reducing hit probability. Republic Aviations. Engineers took a fundamentally different approach with the P-47. They mounted 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, but positioned them much closer to the fuselage than in other fighters. The inboard guns sat barely 3 feet from the center line. The outboard guns extended only 6 feet from center. When harmonized to converge at 300 yards, this tight grouping created something unprecedented. A cone of fire that maintained lethal density from 200 yards out to 400 yards. The ballistics were straightforward but devastating. Each 50 caliber round weighed 750 grains, approximately half an ounce. It left the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second, carrying 13,000 foot-pounds of energy. When 8 guns fired simultaneously at 800 rounds per minute per gun, the combined rate of fire exceeded 100 rounds per second. A 1-second burst put 100 rounds into the air. A 2-second burst delivered 200 rounds. But raw numbers didn't capture the psychological reality. The visual effect of 8 synchronized 50 caliber machine guns firing from a tight grouping created an optical illusion. To a pilot facing the Thunderbolt head-on, the tracer streams appeared to originate from a single point, spreading outward in a widening cone like water from a fire hose. This was particularly true at night or in poor visibility, when the muzzle flashes blended together into one sustained flash of light. German pilots who survived head-on engagements with P-47 seconds described the experience in remarkably similar terms. A wall of fire. An impenetrable barrier. A river of tracers. The descriptions emphasized not individual rounds, but a continuous, overwhelming volume of projectiles that seemed to fill space itself. Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 26's 3rd Gruppe, analyzed captured P-47 seconds in April 1943. His report to Luftwaffe headquarters included detailed measurements of the gun installation. The Americans have sacrificed wing space normally reserved for fuel and ammunition to create an armament installation of unprecedented weight, he wrote. Each aircraft carries 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, weight approximately 2,000 pounds, fully loaded. This represents firepower 3 times greater than our standard fighters, concentrated in a firing envelope that maintains effectiveness across a much wider range bracket. Naumann understood the tactical implications immediately. Against such armament, he concluded, frontal attacks become extremely hazardous. The volume of fire creates a probability of catastrophic damage, even if the enemy pilot's aim is imperfect. Recommend development of alternative tactics emphasizing beam and rear quarter attacks. His recommendation was ignored. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized speed and aggression. Frontal attacks remained, standard procedure. The losses mounted accordingly. On April 29, 1943, Jagdgeschwader 2 intercepted P-47 seconds, escorting bombers over Belgium. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer led a starful of Bf-109s in a classic frontal attack, diving from altitude with the sun behind them. Meyer was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders, with over 50 confirmed victories. He had perfected the head-on attack technique against American B-17 bombers, approaching from 12 o'clock high and firing a devastating burst into the cockpit before breaking away. Against the Thunderbolts, the tactic failed catastrophically. Meyer's attack run began at 1,000 meters range. At 800 meters, the lead P-47 opened fire. Meyer saw the muzzle flashes and committed to his attack, certain that his closing speed would carry him through the defensive fire before the American could inflict serious damage. At 600 meters, his windscreen shattered. At 500 meters, his engine cowling exploded. At 400 meters, his left wing folded upward, and his Messerschmitt tumbled into an uncontrollable spin. Meyer managed to bail out at 3,000 feet, suffering severe burns and a broken arm. 2 of his pilots died in their cockpits. A third crash-landed with catastrophic structural damage. The engagement had lasted less than 10 seconds. Not one German fighter had successfully completed an attack run. The 4 Thunderbolts continued their escort mission without loss. Meyer's after-action report, filed from his hospital bed, pulled no punches. "The Americans have created a fighter optimized for defensive firepower," he wrote. "Traditional attack profiles place our aircraft directly in the path of maximum fire concentration. This is tactically unsustainable." The report circulated through Luftwaffe Command. Some officers dismissed it as excuses from pilots who had been outfought. Others recognized it as evidence of a fundamental problem. The P-47 wasn't just another fighter, it was a weapons platform designed around a completely different theory of air combat. Where German fighters emphasized maneuverability and precision gunnery, the Thunderbolt emphasized overwhelming firepower and durability. Where Luftwaffe pilots trained to make every shot count, P-47 pilots were taught to saturate the target area with fire. The philosophical difference reflected deeper contrasts between American and German military-industrial culture. Germany's aviation industry produced fighters as precision instruments. America's industry produced fighters as mass-manufactured weapons systems. One approach valued elegance, the other valued effectiveness. By May 1943, German pilots across the Western Front were independently discovering the same truth. Attacking a P-47 from ahead was suicide. The aircraft's 8-gun armament created a lethal zone that extended from 200 yards out to 400 yards. Any fighter entering that zone faced near-certain destruction. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Focke-Wulf 190 closing head-on with a P-47 at a combined speed of 800 miles per hour would cover the distance from 400 yards to 200 yards in less than 2 seconds. During that time, the Thunderbolt's guns would fire approximately 200 rounds. Even assuming modest accuracy, 20 to 30 rounds would strike the attacking fighter. A single 50 caliber round could destroy an engine, sever control cables, or kill a pilot. 10 rounds would catastrophically damage any single-engine fighter. 20 rounds was obliteration. German pilots began modifying their tactics, approaching from the beam or astern when possible, avoiding head-on passes entirely. But the tactical constraints of bomber escort made such caution difficult. P-47 seconds flew top cover for bomber formations, maintaining altitude advantage. To attack the bombers, German fighters had to climb through the escort screen. The geometry of interception often forced head-on approaches whether the attackers wanted them or not. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, a Bf 109 pilot with 33 victories, described the dilemma in his war diary. "We must attack through the American escorts to reach the bombers," he wrote on June 2, 1943, "but attacking through the Thunderbolts costs us more aircraft than we destroy among the bombers. The mathematics no longer favor us. Every mission we fly weaker. Every mission they grow stronger." The casualty statistics supported Knoke's assessment. In May and June 1943, Jagdgeschwader II, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, lost 47 aircraft in combat with P-47 seconds. They claimed 19 Thunderbolts destroyed. The loss ratio was unsustainable. Even worse, many of the German pilots killed were experienced veterans, men with hundreds of combat hours and dozens of victories. The Americans were losing, newer pilots flying newer aircraft. Germany was losing its irreplaceable core of tactical expertise. Senior Luftwaffe officers recognized the crisis, but struggled to develop effective counter-tactics. Some advocated abandoning frontal attacks entirely, concentrating instead on slashing attacks from above and behind. Others pushed for development of heavier armament, hoping that larger cannons might match the P-47's firepower. A few understood that the problem wasn't primarily tactical or technical, it was industrial. The Americans could afford to arm their fighters with 8 heavy machine guns and 3,000 rounds of ammunition because they had the industrial capacity to produce the weapons, the ammunition, and the airframes to carry them. Germany's factories, increasingly targeted by Allied bombing, struggled to produce sufficient fighters with standard armament. Creating heavier armed variants would reduce production numbers even further. The strategic calculus was brutal. Every tactical advantage the P-47 demonstrated reflected an underlying American material superiority that Germany couldn't match. The Thunderbolt's 8-gun armament was simply the most visible manifestation of an industrial depth that dwarfed the Reich's capacity. Throughout summer 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence officers collected reports of P-47 encounters, searching for tactical vulnerabilities. They found none that didn't require fundamental changes to German doctrine. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any Luftwaffe fighter could follow. It could climb above most German interceptors' effective ceiling. It could absorb damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, and when approached from ahead, it generated a volume of fire that made traditional attack profiles suicidal. One intelligence summary, dated July 10, 1943, concluded, "The P-47 represents a paradigm shift in fighter design philosophy. Rather than optimizing maneuverability, the Americans have created an aircraft that wins through systematic application of superior power, firepower, and structural strength. Our fighters remain technically capable of defeating the P-47 inches turning combat. However, the P-47 pilot who enters turning combat with our fighters is either inexperienced or foolish. Experienced American pilots exploit their aircraft's advantages, speed, climb rate, altitude performance, and firepower, while refusing to engage in maneuvering combat where our advantages apply. This tactical discipline, combined with the P-47's overwhelming firepower, makes it the most formidable fighter aircraft currently operating over Western Europe." The report's conclusion was prescient, but arrived too late to fundamentally alter Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. By autumn 1943, the patterns were established. German fighters would continue attempting to intercept American bomber formations. P-47 seconds would continue flying top cover. And German pilots would continue dying in disproportionate numbers, shot down by an aircraft whose primary weapon wasn't speed or maneuverability, but the simple, overwhelming violence of 8 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns firing as one. Part 2. The true horror of the P-47's convergent firepower revealed itself not in single encounters, but in the cumulative psychological damage inflicted across hundreds of engagements throughout 1943 and 44. German pilots who survived their first head-on encounter with a Thunderbolt carried the memory like a scar. Those who attempted a second attack often didn't survive to describe it. Oberleutnant Walter Schuck, who would finish the war with 206 confirmed victories, experienced his introduction to P-47 firepower on August 14, 1943. His Staffel intercepted a formation of Thunderbolts, escorting B-17 seconds over the Dutch coast. Schuck, flying a Bf-109G6, approached from the sun, with altitude advantage. Standard doctrine. Perfect positioning. He selected the trailing P-47 as his target and committed to a diving frontal attack. "I had done this maneuver perhaps 50 times before," Schuck recalled in a 1968 interview, "against Spitfires, against P-38 seconds, even against the earlier P-40 seconds. You close fast, fire a concentrated burst, break away before the enemy can react. The closing speed protects you because their guns are wing-mounted and spread apart. Most of their fire passes to either side of you." The Thunderbolt was different. "At 600 meters, I saw the Americans' guns open fire," Schuck continued. "It didn't look like 8 separate weapons. It looked like a single massive cannon mounted in the nose. The tracer stream was so dense I could barely see the aircraft behind it. Every 4th or 5th round was a tracer, which meant between each visible tracer were 4 invisible rounds. I was flying into a river of metal." Schuck's instinct saved him. Instead of continuing his attack run, he broke left at 500 meters, rolling his Messerschmitt into a violent, evasive maneuver. 50-caliber rounds hammered his right wing, tearing through aluminum skin and support structures. One round severed his radio antenna. Another punctured his coolant reservoir. He dove away trailing white glycol vapor, nursing his damaged fighter back to base at minimum power. "I counted 19 holes in my aircraft," he said, 19 hits in perhaps 2 seconds of exposure. "If I had continued the attack for even 1 more second, I would have died. The mathematics were absolute." Schuck never attempted another head-on attack against a P-47. Neither did most pilots who survived their first encounter. The problem was that new pilots, fresh from training schools where they learned doctrine developed before the P-47's introduction, continued attempting frontal attacks because that's what they'd been taught. The casualty rate among replacement pilots in 1944 was catastrophic. Some pilot training had been reduced to as little as 30 hours of flight time before assignment to combat units. These men arrived at fighter squadrons with theoretical knowledge of air combat, but almost no practical experience. They knew that frontal attacks worked. They didn't know that they worked only against aircraft that weren't P-47 seconds. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, eventual 220 Victory ace, commanded Jagdgeschwader 3's first Gruppe through 1944. In his post-war memoir, he described the impossible task of keeping inexperienced pilots alive long enough to learn. "They would arrive on Monday," Baer wrote. "I would brief them never to attack the Thunderbolts head-on. Never. If you must engage, attack from the beam or from astern. If they turn toward you, break off immediately." They would nod, understanding nothing. By Friday, half of them would be dead. The physics of the P-47's gun convergence made survival statistics worse for German pilots who did everything else correctly. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun fired a projectile that retained lethal energy out to 2,000 yards. Even at extreme range, a 50 caliber round could penetrate aircraft skin, damage systems, or kill a pilot. The 8-gun installation on the P-47, harmonized to converge at 300 yards, created a lethal cone that was tight enough to be devastating at point-blank range, yet dispersed enough to maintain effectiveness at distance. American armorers typically harmonized P-47 guns using one of 2 patterns. The first pattern, called spot harmonization, set all 8 guns to converge at a single point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. This created maximum fire density at that specific range. Within a 3-foot circle at 300 yards, all 8 guns' trajectories intersected. The second pattern, called area harmonization, staggered the convergence points between 250 and 350 yards. This created a larger, lethal zone with slightly reduced peak density. Combat experience favored area harmonization. The longer lethal zone compensated for range estimation errors and target movement. A P-47 pilot using area harmonization could open fire at 400 yards and maintain effective fire all the way down to 200 yards. Throughout that 200-yard bracket, at least 4 to 6 guns remained on target regardless of minor aiming errors. German pilots who analyzed captured P-47 seconds measured the gun spacing and calculated the convergence patterns. The results were sobering. A Luftwaffe technical report from October 1943 noted, "The American 8-gun installation achieves fire density comparable to our 30mm Mk-108 cannon installation, but with 8 times the ammunition capacity and 3 times the effective range." A P-47 carries sufficient ammunition for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. Our Mk-108 installation provides approximately 7 seconds of fire before ammunition exhaustion. The report's author, whose name was redacted from surviving copies, concluded with unusual bluntness, "We cannot match this firepower with existing production capacity. Even if we could manufacture equivalent weapons, the weight penalty would reduce our fighters' performance below acceptable parameters. The Americans have optimized for firepower at the expense of other characteristics. We have optimized for performance at the expense of firepower. In the tactical environment currently prevailing over Western Europe, their optimization proves superior." The tactical environment heavily favored the P-47's strengths. By late 1943, American fighters flew top cover at altitudes where the P-47's turbocharged engine gave it decisive performance advantage. German fighters attempting to intercept bomber formations had to climb through this fighter screen. The geometry forced them into head-on or nearly head-on engagements, where the P-47's firepower advantage was absolute. Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most elite units, lost 14 aircraft to P-47's in a single week in November 1943. 7 of those losses occurred in frontal attacks. The squadron's commander, Major Johannes Seifert, filed a desperate request for tactical guidance. "Our standard attack profiles prove ineffective against the American heavy fighters," he wrote. "Request instruction on alternative engagement methods or authorization to disengage when facing superior numbers of P-47's." The response from Luftwaffe headquarters was bureaucratic and useless. Fighter units will press home attacks against enemy bomber formations, regardless of escort strength. Aggressive action remains the foundation of fighter doctrine. The order reflected a command structure increasingly disconnected from tactical reality. Senior officers, many of whom hadn't flown combat since 1941, continued planning operations based on assumptions that no longer applied. The P-47 wasn't just another escort fighter. It had fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of daylight operations over Western Europe. American pilots, meanwhile, refined their defensive tactics to maximize the P-47's firepower advantage. The standard defensive maneuver against a head-on attack was simple: turn toward the attacker and fire. This did 2 things. First, it presented the P-47's 8-gun armament directly at the threat. Second, it forced the attacking German pilot to make an instantaneous decision: continue the attack through devastating defensive fire, or break away and abandon the attack. Most German pilots chose survival. Those who didn't often died. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group described the psychology of head-on defense in a 1944 interview. "When you see a German fighter coming straight at you, the natural instinct is to turn away, to evade," Johnson said. "But in the Jug, the P-47's nickname among American pilots, you learn to do the opposite. You turn into him and hammer down on the trigger. 850s create a wall of fire that fills his windscreen. Most of them break off. The ones who don't, well, we don't see them anymore." Johnson himself survived a legendary encounter on June 26, 1943, when his P-47 absorbed extensive damage from German fighters yet brought him home safely. But many of the hits he took came from beam and stern attacks. No German pilot managed to press home a successful frontal attack against his aircraft. "They tried," Johnson recalled. "They'd set up the attack, commit to the dive, then see those 8 guns light up and break away. I don't blame them. I wouldn't want to fly through that either." The convergent firepower created another, less obvious advantage: psychological dominance of the engagement. German pilots, approaching P-47's, had to consider whether to attack at all. Every decision point favored the Americans. Attack head-on? Suicide. Attack from the beam? The P-47 could turn into the attack, bringing its guns to bear. Attack from astern? The P-47 could dive away at speeds no German fighter could match. The cumulative effect was paralysis. German fighters often declined combat entirely, allowing bomber formations to proceed unmolested rather than engaging escorts. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major Günther Roll, eventual 275 victory ace and 3rd highest scoring pilot in history, transferred from the Eastern Front to France in January 1944. His first mission against American formations shocked him. "In Russia, we fought aircraft we could defeat," Rahl said in a post-war interview. "The Yak-3 was dangerous, the La-5 was tough. But they were fighters we understood. with capabilities similar to our own. The P-47 was something else entirely. It didn't fight like a fighter. It fought like a bomber with 8 machine guns. Rahl's comparison was more accurate than he might have realized. Republic Aviation had designed the P-47 around the same philosophy that guided American bomber development: durability, firepower, and systems redundancy over elegance or performance optimization. The result was an aircraft that absorbed punishment, delivered devastating offensive fire, and returned home reliably. These characteristics proved more valuable in sustained combat operations than the maneuverability and grace German fighters emphasized. The 8-gun installation also provided tactical flexibility that wing-mounted guns couldn't match. P-47 pilots could engage targets at ranges from 100 yards out to 500 yards with reasonable hit probability. The tight gun grouping meant that even at extended range, most rounds passed close to the point of aim. German fighters with wing-mounted guns saw their effective range limited to approximately 300 yards. Beyond that distance, the spread between wing-mounted guns reduced hit probability to near zero. This range advantage proved decisive in many engagements. P-47 pilots could open fire earlier, forcing German fighters to maneuver defensively before reaching effective range for their own weapons. The psychological pressure of incoming fire, even if not immediately damaging, disrupted German attack coordination. Staffel leaders found their formations breaking apart as individual pilots maneuvered to avoid fire, destroying the tactical cohesion necessary for effective bomber interception. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, eventual 176 Victory Ace, analyzed the problem in a 1944 tactical assessment. The Americans have created a fighter that doesn't require exceptional piloting skill to be effective, Steinhoff wrote. A mediocre pilot in a P-47 can defeat a skilled pilot in a Bf-109 simply by exploiting his aircraft's advantages: firepower, durability, and power. Our aircraft require skill to use effectively. Theirs require only discipline, the discipline to refuse combat on unfavorable terms and to engage only when conditions favor them. Steinhoff's assessment identified the fundamental advantage. The P-47 lowered the skill threshold for combat effectiveness. A newly trained American pilot with 100 hours of flight time could survive and achieve victories in a Thunderbolt by following simple rules. Don't turn with German fighters. Maintain altitude advantage. Use speed to dictate engagement terms. When attacked, turn into the threat and fire. A German pilot with equivalent training in a Bf-109 required far more skill, judgment, and experience to survive similar encounters. The ammunition capacity compounded these advantages. P-47 pilots could afford to fire longer, bursts at longer ranges, because they carried 3,400 rounds divided among 8 guns. That equated to 425 rounds per gun, or approximately 32 seconds of sustained fire per gun. In practice, pilots rarely expended all their ammunition in a single mission. The psychological comfort of abundant ammunition encouraged aggressive tactics. German pilots, carrying perhaps 120 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 300 rounds of machine gun ammunition, had to conserve their limited supply, firing only when certain of hits. This conservation reflex created hesitation at critical moments. German pilots would set up perfect attacks, close to effective range, then hold fire an extra second to ensure optimal shot placement. That extra second of delay often meant the difference between a successful attack and getting caught in defensive fire. P-47 pilots suffered no such hesitation. They could open fire at 400 yards and walk their fire into the target, adjusting aim based on tracer observation. The technical term was hosing, spraying an area with fire until hits were achieved. Luftwaffe training emphasized precision gunnery. American training emphasized volume of fire. In extended campaigns, volume proved more effective than precision. The typical P-47 combat mission involved multiple engagements. Pilots might fire on 3, 4, even 5 targets during a single sortie. The abundant ammunition capacity enabled this aggressive posture. German pilots typically engaged once or twice per mission before ammunition concerns forced disengagement. The mathematical result favored America. More engagement opportunities per sortie, more chances to inflict damage, more cumulative losses imposed on the enemy. By spring 1944, the cumulative attrition had effectively destroyed Luftwaffe fighter capability in the West. The statistics were damning. In March 1944, German fighter units in France and the Low Countries possessed approximately 750 serviceable aircraft. By June 1944, that number had dropped to approximately 400. Losses exceeded production. Experienced pilots died faster than replacement pilots could be trained. The organizational cohesion of elite fighter wings collapsed as casualties mounted. The P-47's 8-gun armament played a central role in this collapse. Every frontal attack that failed due to defensive fire was an attack that didn't reach the bombers. Every German fighter destroyed in a head-on engagement was one less interceptor available for subsequent missions. The cumulative effect strangled German fighter effectiveness. Bomber formations that in 1943 had faced coordinated attacks by 50 to 100 fighters now encountered fragmented resistance by 20 to 30 aircraft. The reduced interception strength meant more bombers reached their targets, delivering more destruction to German industry, further reducing Germany's ability to replace losses. The vicious cycle accelerated through summer 1944. D-Day on June 6th brought the air war to crisis intensity. P-47 seconds flew ground attack missions, bomber escort missions, and fighter sweeps, sometimes all in a single day. The 9th Air Force alone fielded over 1,000 P-47 seconds supporting the Normandy invasion. German fighters attempting to intervene faced overwhelming numbers, backed by overwhelming firepower. The 8-gun installation that had made head-on attacks suicidal in 1943 now made any combat engagement against P-47 seconds a calculated risk with poor odds of success. Lieutenant Heinz Noak's diary entries from June 1944 captured the desperation. June 7th. Lost 4 pilots today. The Americans are everywhere. June 9th. 3 more gone. We are fighting 10 to 1 odds. June 12th. I don't know how much longer we can continue. Every mission is a cat we are, death sentence. The Thunderbolts own the sky. The ownership was absolute. By July 1944, P-47 seconds ranged freely across occupied France, attacking ground targets at will. The 850 caliber machine guns proved devastatingly effective against soft-skinned vehicles, locomotives, and troop concentrations. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of the R-2800 engine. Unteroffizier Ernst Schmidt, a Wehrmacht infantryman, described a P-47 attack in his diary. 8 of them came out of the morning sun. The first pass destroyed our trucks. The second pass killed anyone caught in the open. We couldn't fight back. We could only hide and pray they would move on to other targets. The ground attack missions added another psychological dimension to German hatred of the P-47. The same aircraft that had made bomber interception nearly impossible now hunted German forces on the ground with impunity. The 8-gun armament that created a defensive barrier in air combat became an offensive weapon of terrifying effectiveness against surface targets. Each gun firing armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate light armor, destroy engines, and ignite fuel tanks. 8 guns firing in concert could reduce a column of vehicles to burning wreckage in seconds. American pilots adapted quickly to ground attack tactics that maximized the P-47's firepower. The standard attack profile involved a shallow dive at 30 to 45 degrees, opening fire at 800 yards and maintaining fire through the target and pull out at 300 yards. This gave approximately 3 seconds of firing time, during which all 8 guns remained on target. 3 seconds meant approximately 240 rounds fired. Against a locomotive, a truck convoy, or a train, that volume of fire was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe had no effective counter. German fighters attempting to protect ground forces from P-47 attacks faced the same tactical dilemma that plagued bomber defense. Engaging the P-47 seconds meant accepting combat on American terms. Most German pilots chose discretion. They would watch from altitude as Thunderbolts strafed German columns, unwilling to dive into engagement range where the P-47's firepower advantage became decisive. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers on the ground felt abandoned by their own air force. German pilots felt impotent, unable to protect their comrades without accepting suicidal risks. Hauptmann Hermann Graf, eventual 212 victory ace, described the moral burden in a 1945 interview with Allied interrogators. "We saw our troops being destroyed from the air," Graf said. "We wanted to help them. But attacking the Thunderbolts meant losing aircraft we couldn't replace and pilots we couldn't train fast enough to matter. The mathematics were cruel. We could die bravely and change nothing, or we could survive and preserve some combat capability for what? We didn't know anymore." The nihilism in Graf's words reflected the broader collapse of German morale by late 1944. The P-47's dominance wasn't just tactical or technical, it was psychological. It represented the visible manifestation of American material superiority. Every P-47 that appeared over Germany carried with it the implicit message: "We can build these by the thousands, arm them with weapons you cannot match, and send them against you until you are destroyed." The 8-gun installation was simply the most immediate, most visceral proof of that message. Part 3. The end came not with a single decisive battle, but with the slow, grinding realization that resistance had become pointless. By autumn 1944, experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had survived 2, 3, sometimes 4 years of combat understood that they were fighting a war already lost. The P-47's 8-gun armament had become a symbol of that inevitable defeat, a physical manifestation of Americans' industrial supremacy that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. Leutnant Franz Stigler, who had survived his first encounter with P-47 firepower in March 1943, flew his last combat mission on November 22, 1944. His Focke-Wulf 190 had been patched and repaired so many times that mechanics joked it contained more replacement parts than original components. He intercepted a formation of B-17 seconds over Bavaria, knowing before he attacked that P-47 escorts would be there, knowing that engaging them meant accepting risks that would have seemed insane 2 years earlier. The Thunderbolts appeared exactly where he expected them, high and fast, diving through the German formation with guns blazing. Stigler watched 3 of his squadron mates go down in flames in less than a minute. He fired at a bomber, saw his rounds strike the wing, then broke away as a P-47 turned toward him. The familiar sight filled his gun sight. 8 muzzle flashes, merging into a single point of light, the tracer stream that looked like a river of fire. He dove away, using every trick he'd learned to survive. His aircraft shuddered as rounds struck the tail. He made it home. 7 of his squadron didn't. That evening, Stigler wrote his final combat report. The language was different from his careful technical description in 1943. "We cannot win," he wrote simply. "The Americans replace every loss. We cannot replace ours. Their pilots improve with experience. Ours die before gaining experience. Their aircraft grow stronger. Ours grow weaker through material shortages. The outcome is mathematically certain." His commander filed the report without comment. Everyone knew Stigler was right. The war had become an equation with only one solution. German fighter production in November 1944 reached approximately 1,000 aircraft, a seemingly impressive number. But losses exceeded 1,300. The gap widened, monthly. Meanwhile, American fighter production exceeded 5,000 aircraft that same month, with P-47 seconds representing nearly half that total. The mathematics extended beyond production numbers to combat effectiveness. Each P-47 that rolled off Republic Aviation's assembly lines carried the same 8-gun armament, the same ammunition capacity, the same capability to generate overwhelming firepower. Quality control ensured that a pilot transitioning from one P-47 to another would find identical gun harmonization, identical performance characteristics, identical systems. German fighters showed increasing variation as material shortages forced substitutions and modifications. A pilot flying a Bf-109G 6 inches September might find significantly different performance characteristics than the same model in November, as aluminum alloys degraded in quality and engines suffered from inferior fuels. The P-47's 8-gun installation became the standard against which post-war fighter armament was measured. American designers recognized that the combination of tight gun grouping, high rate of fire, and abundant ammunition created decisive tactical advantages. The F-86 Sabre, developed in the late 1940s, mounted 650 caliber guns using lessons learned from P-47 combat experience. Later fighters, like the F-4 Phantom, initially mounted no guns at all, relying on missiles, but combat experience in Vietnam forced a return to gun armament. When the F-15 Eagle was designed in the 1970s, it mounted a 20mm Gatling gun, but the philosophy remained unchanged. Concentrated firepower, abundant ammunition, engagement capability across multiple range brackets. German designers drew different lessons. Post-war Luftwaffe commanders, analyzing their defeat, emphasized the need for heavier individual weapon installations rather than multiple lighter weapons. The philosophy persisted into jet fighter design, with aircraft like the MiG-15 mounting two 23mm and one 37mm cannon instead of multiple smaller caliber weapons. The debate between concentrated heavy armament and distributed lighter armament continued through decades of fighter development, but combat statistics consistently favored the American approach. More guns firing more rounds created higher probability of inflicting damage. For the German pilots who survived, the memory of P-47 firepower remained vivid decades after the war ended. Walter Schuck, interviewed in 1982 at age 61, still remembered the first time he saw 850 caliber guns firing in unison. It looked like the aircraft had one enormous cannon in its nose, he recalled. You couldn't see individual tracers. You saw a solid stream of light. I understood immediately that attacking such an aircraft head-on would be suicide. Many of my comrades didn't understand until too late. Franz Stigler, who emigrated to Canada after the war and eventually befriended American bomber pilot Charlie Brown in a remarkable post-war reconciliation, reflected on the P-47's impact in a 1990 interview. "We were good pilots, flying good aircraft," Stigler said, "but they had better aircraft in greater numbers with more powerful weapons. In the end, wars are not won by individual skill. They are won by the side that can produce more effective weapons and replace its losses faster than the enemy." The P-47's 8 guns taught us that lesson every day. The lesson resonated beyond tactical aviation. The P-47's firepower advantage reflected America's fundamental strategic approach. Overwhelming material superiority applied systematically until enemy resistance collapsed. The same philosophy guided American armor development, artillery production, and naval construction. Build reliable weapons in vast quantities, arm them as heavily as possible, and deploy them faster than the enemy can respond. Elegance and technical sophistication mattered less than effectiveness and availability. When the war ended in May 1945, P-47 seconds flew reconnaissance missions over silent German airfields, their 8 guns finally quiet. The aircraft that had terrorized the Luftwaffe for 2 years had achieved what strategic planners intended: air superiority so complete that German forces operated without effective air cover. The 8-gun installation that made head-on attacks suicidal had contributed directly to that outcome. Engagement by engagement, mission by mission, gradually destroying German fighter capability through sustained attrition. The final irony was that by war's end, German engineers had developed fighters with potentially superior performance to the P-47. The Me-262 jet, the Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor, the Do-335 night fighter, all represented advanced designs that might have challenged Allied air superiority under different circumstances. But they arrived too late, in too few numbers, flown by pilots with inadequate training and supported by an industrial base collapsing under sustained bombardment. The P-47's 8 guns had helped create those conditions, making the bomber offensive possible, destroying the Luftwaffe's defensive capability and demonstrating that American air power couldn't be defeated by technical innovation alone. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.